Welcome to The Debate. We are looking back today at, well, what is really the defining trauma of American history, the Civil War. Between 1861 and 1865, the United States tore itself apart. 620,000 soldiers died. That number is so large, it almost becomes abstract. But to put it in perspective, that was roughly 2% of the entire population at the time. If that happened today, we'd be talking about 6 or 7 million dead. But our inquiry today isn't just a recitation of battles and dates. We're interrogating the fundamental why behind the Union victory. Was this outcome a mathematical inevitability written in the ledgers of the Industrial Revolution before the first shot was even fired? Or was the survival of the Union contingent on specific fragile human decisions? I'm arguing the former. The North's victory was a triumph of logistics, industrial capacity, and pure demographic weight.
And I'm here to take the opposing view. To treat the Civil War as a math problem is to, I think, ignore the terrified uncertainty of the people who were actually living through it. If you look at the timeline, the Confederacy didn't need to conquer the North. They just needed to outlast the Northern political will. My argument is that the war was decided by agency, by military brilliance, by political maneuvering, and ultimately by the ideological pivot toward emancipation. The North didn't win because of a spreadsheet. They won because they eventually found the leadership to properly utilize their resources.
Well, let's start with that math problem, because the numbers are frankly overwhelming when we look at the source material regarding the North-South divide on the eve of war. The disparity isn't just large, it's fatal. The North was an industrial powerhouse, rapidly urbanizing and powered by the steam engine. The South was agrarian, locked into a cash crop economy dependent on cotton and, crucially, enslaved labor. But here's the single statistic that I believe dictated the entire conflict. The North possessed 97% of the nation's arms manufacturing capacity.
Wow, 97%?
97%. War is, at its most basic level, the consumption of metal and explosives. The Union had the factories to produce rifles, cannons, and ammunition at a scale the South physically could not match. You can have the bravest soldiers in the world, but if they cannot replace their weapons, they lose. You add to that the population disparity. The Union held 70% of the pre-war population. They had a massive pool of manpower to draw from, while the South was, capping out its reserves almost immediately. The conclusion I draw from the material is that the Confederacy was fighting a war of attrition against a region that had nearly infinite resources compared to them.
Those statistics are impressive on a spreadsheet in 1860, sure, but they don't explain 1861 or 1862. If material superiority was the sole determinant, the Union Army should have marched to Richmond and ended the rebellion in 6 months. They didn't. It took 4 years of slaughter. That's where the inevitability argument collapses for me. The Confederacy held the initiative for years because war is not fought by factories, it's fought by humans. The South had the home field advantage. They were fighting a defensive war on their own terrain.
Meaning they didn't have to win.
Exactly. That is a crucial distinction. The Confederacy didn't need to occupy New York or Boston or burn Chicago. They just needed to defend their borders and make the war so costly in blood and treasure that the North would simply quit. Let them go. And they almost succeeded because of the human element. Specifically, superior military leadership in the early war. The material highlights the West Point factor.
Right, the military academy.
Yes, the top graduates of West Point, men like Robert E. Lee, J.E.B. Stuart, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, they resigned their federal commissions to fight for their home states. They took that institutional knowledge and used it to humiliate superior Union forces. This wasn't about who had more cannons. It was about who knew where to put them.
Okay, let's dig into that leadership aspect. You're arguing that tactical brilliance basically neutralized the industrial advantage.
Absolutely. I mean, look at the First Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas as the South called it. On paper, the Union had the numbers and the supplies. They marched out of Washington expecting a picnic. But they ran into Stonewall Jackson. His refusal to yield on Henry Hill, standing like a Stonewall, it turned the tide. The Union Army, which was better equipped and better fed, broke and ran all the way back to Washington, D.C. That wasn't a failure of supply chains, that was a failure of nerve and leadership. The Union spent the first half of the war cycling through generals like George McClellan, who were, well, they were paralyzed by caution, despite having every material advantage. The South was punching above its weight because they had generals who understood how to gamble.
I won't deny Lee's tactical genius or the incompetence of early Union commanders. I won't. But I view those early Confederate victories as delaying the inevitable, not changing the outcome. While Lee was winning battles in Virginia, the Anaconda Plan was slowly suffocating the South.
For our listeners, maybe define the Anaconda Plan. It's a great name, but what did it actually entail?
Of course. It was the strategy devised by General Winfield Scott right at the start. He was old, too fat to mount a horse, but his mind was sharp. He pictured the Confederacy like a victim being constricted by a snake. Step 1, blockade the southern ports so they can't sell cotton or buy guns from Europe. Step 2, seize control of the Mississippi River to cut the Confederacy in half. It wasn't about flashy battles, it was about economic strangulation. The material notes that while blockade runners, these small, fast ships, did smuggle goods in, they could never bring enough heavy equipment. By 1863, the South was dealing with massive inflation. A barrel of flour cost hundreds of Confederate dollars. You mentioned nerve, but nerve doesn't feed an army. The Union eventually found a general who understood the math of the war, Ulysses S. Grant.
Right. Grant is often dismissed as a butcher in historical memory, though the source material is, I think, kinder to him.
Because he was a realist, he understood logistics. When he captured Forts Henry and Donelson, and later Vicksburg, he wasn't just defeating armies, he was dismantling the Confederate infrastructure. Capturing Vicksburg gave the Union total control of the Mississippi. That is material reality crushing the rebellion. Grant knew he could lose 2 men for every one of Lee's and still win, because the northern recruiting offices were full and the factories were running 24/7.
But Grant didn't take command of all Union armies until 1864. For 3 years, that industrial juggernaut was flailing, and this brings me to a crucial point about technology. You focus on the production numbers, but the application of technology requires innovation, not just mass production. The South was incredibly innovative out of necessity.
You're referring to the ironclads?
The naval war, yes, the Union had the blockade, but the Confederacy raised a sunken Union frigate, the Merrimac, slapped iron plates on the hull, and created the CSS Virginia. It was a terrifying weapon. It sailed out and destroyed wooden Union warships with ease because their cannonballs just, bounced off it. It threatened to break the blockade entirely until the Union's monitor arrived. My point is, the South wasn't just sitting there waiting to be crushed by industry. They were adapting. If the monitor hadn't arrived when it did, and it was a matter of days, the naval war could have flipped.
But the monitor did arrive, and it arrived because the North could build it faster. That brings me right back to the industrial gap. Let's talk about the technology on land. The material brings up a specific weapon that I think illustrates this perfectly, the Spencer Carbine.
A repeating rifle.
Right. For those who aren't gun enthusiasts, let's break down why this matters. The standard weapon of the war was a muzzle-loading musket. To fire it, you have to stand up, pour powder down the barrel, drop a ball in, ram it down with a rod, put a percussion cap on. It's slow and clumsy. A good soldier gets off maybe 3 shots a minute. The Spencer was a lever-action breech loader. You load a tube of 7 metal cartridges into the stock, you just crank the lever and fire. You can fire 14 to 20 rounds a minute. By 1863, Union cavalry units were getting these. The Confederates were still using muzzle-loaders, sometimes even captured ones because they couldn't manufacture their own.
There's a quote in the material about that. 1 man armed with a Spencer is equivalent to 3 with any other arm.
Exactly. It's a force multiplier. And look at the railroads. The North had 21,000 miles of track. The South had 8,000. After the Battle of Gaines' Mill, the Union used that network to evacuate casualties and bring in fresh troops. The South couldn't move men between the Eastern and Western theaters fast enough to stop the bleeding. The North was fighting a modern industrial war. The South was fighting a heroic but pre-industrial defense.
I grant you the railroads were decisive. However, technology doesn't fight in a vacuum. The source material emphasizes the wretched conditions for soldiers on both sides. It didn't matter if you had a repeating rifle, if you were dying of dysentery. Disease killed twice as many men as bullets in this war.
That's a fair point. The camps were petri dishes.
And let's talk about hardtack. The Union soldiers were fed, sure, but what were they fed? Hardtack was essentially flour and water baked into a brick so hard you had to soak it in coffee to bite it without breaking a tooth. The material mentions it was often infested with weevils, worms. Soldiers would drop the cracker in coffee and skim the worms off the top. My point is, the misery of trench warfare, the lice, the mud, that affected morale equally. High desertion rates plagued the Union Army just as they did the Confederates. If the material advantage was so overwhelming, why was the Northern public so close to giving up?
You think they were close?
Dangerously close. And this is where the agency argument for me wins out. The turning point of the war wasn't the Spencer Carbine. It was the Emancipation Proclamation.
I would argue that was a political move, but go on.
It was a moral revolution. Remember, the war began with a goal of preserving the Union. That's a constitutional abstraction. It's hard to ask a man to die for a legal concept. But in 1863, Abraham Lincoln transformed the war into a crusade against slavery. He changed the why. This wasn't inevitable. Lincoln was pressured to compromise, to leave slavery alone to keep the border states happy. He took a massive political risk.
I agree it was significant, but I view it through the lens of manpower. It comes back to the math for me.
It's more than math, but let's look at the immediate impact. Frederick Douglass said, "Unchain that black hand," and the North finally allowed African-American men to enlist. We're talking about the United States Colored Troops, the USCT, nearly 200,000 men. The 54th Massachusetts is the famous example. These men fought with a ferocity that stunned the Confederates because they were fighting for their own liberation. But it also did something else. It neutralized Europe.
The foreign policy angle.
Right. The South's only real hope for victory was intervention. They believed King Cotton would force Britain or France to enter the war on their side to break the blockade. Britain was tempted. They wanted the cotton. But once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, the war became about freedom versus slavery. The British public would never support a war to defend slavery. Lincoln's pen killed the Confederate foreign policy. That is human agency altering the strategic landscape.
It certainly isolated them. But regarding the USCT, I see that as the final weight on the scale of resources. The South had a population of 9 million, but 4 million were enslaved. That means nearly half their population was actively hoping for their defeat. The South was paralyzed by the need to police this internal population. They couldn't arm them, though they desperately debated it at the very end, because doing so would undermine the entire ideology of the Confederacy. The North, however, could mobilize that manpower. It was a resource transfer. The North gained 200,000 soldiers. The South lost its labor force. It was the demographic hammer falling.
But it required the political will to swing that hammer. That's my point. The resources existed, but without the political decision to emancipate, they remained untapped. And speaking of political will, we have to look at 1864. Your theory relies on the idea that the North would just keep fighting until the South ran out of bullets. But in the summer of 1864, the North was done.
You're referring to the election.
The election of 1864 is the single biggest counter-argument to inevitability. We often forget that Lincoln had to run for re-election in the middle of the war. His opponent was George McClellan, the very general Lincoln had fired for being too cautious. McClellan was running on a peace platform. The war had dragged on. Grant's overland campaign in Virginia was producing casualty lists that horrified the North. Cold Harbor alone saw thousands fall in minutes. Lincoln himself wrote a memo in August 1864 expecting to lose. If McClellan wins, he likely negotiates a peace. The Confederacy survives. The Union is not restored.
That is a terrifying what if.
And it almost happened. It took specific human successes to change the narrative. General Sherman capturing Atlanta in September 1864, and Admiral Farragut taking Mobile Bay, famously shouting, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Those victories swung the Northern electorate. If Atlanta holds out for 2 more months, The industrial might of the North wouldn't have mattered because the political will would have evaporated.
I see the political precarity, I do. But consider the hard war that Sherman was waging. Even if McClellan had won, could the South have actually functioned as a state? By 1864, Sherman wasn't just defeating armies. He was destroying the concept of the South. His march to the sea was logistical warfare. He marched from Atlanta to Savannah, cutting a swath of destruction 60 miles wide. He twisted railroad rails around trees, Sherman's neckties, so they couldn't be fixed. He burned crops. He demonstrated that the Union could go anywhere and destroy anything.
It was psychological warfare.
It was total war. And look at the siege of Petersburg at the end. Grant just latched on to Lee and wouldn't let go. He extended the trench lines further and further west. He knew Lee's army was thinning out. It was a mathematical geometry. Lee had to stretch his line until it snapped. When the surrender at Appomattox finally came, it wasn't because Lee was outsmarted. It was because his men were starving and they had no ammunition. The supply chain had ceased to exist.
At the very end, yes, the cupboard was bare. But even then, there was a choice. This is the last gasp of agency. Lee had officers urging him to disperse the army into the mountains and fight a guerrilla war. They could have kept the conflict going for decades, bleeding the occupier dry, much like insurgencies we've seen in the 20th century.
But he didn't.
He didn't. Robert E. Lee made a human decision. He looked at the wreckage and decided the cost was too high. He chose to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia. That wasn't a steam engine making a decision. That was a man staring into the abyss and blinking. The end of the war was a negotiated act of human agency.
But one could argue his agency was constrained by the fact that he was surrounded by 100,000 well-fed Union troops. The material reality forced the decision. But let's zoom out to the aftermath. The North won the war. The material side was victorious. But did they win the peace?
That is the tragedy of the story. The 13th Amendment ended slavery legally. The Union was preserved geographically, but the source material is very clear that the ideological conflict didn't end at Appomattox. We see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the failure of Reconstruction, and the century-long struggle for civil rights. The North had the industrial power to conquer the South, but they didn't have the sustained political attention span to reshape Southern society.
It seems the industrial might could break the Confederate Army, but it couldn't fix the underlying societal breakage.
Precisely. You can't mechanize a change of heart.
So where does this leave us? I think the Civil War serves as the first true example of modern war. It showed that gallantry and individual heroism are no match for a mobilized industrial base. The Union's ability to field, feed, and arm millions of men, backed by that 97% manufacturing statistic, created a momentum that the South simply could not arrest. The Anaconda Plan was slow, but it was inexorable.
And yet, I look at the timeline. It took 4 years. It took 620,000 lives. If it was just a matter of logistics, it should have been a police action. The fact that the Confederacy, outnumbered and outgunned, brought the Union to the brink of political collapse in 1864 proves that history is not determined by resources alone. It required the strategic brilliance of Sherman, the tenacity of Grant, and the moral courage of Lincoln to actually translate those resources into victory.
It's a tension that defines the conflict. The crushing weight of the inevitable against the desperate improvisation of the possible.
And as we look at the photos from that era, the faces of the soldiers, the ruined cities, we are reminded that these weren't inevitable statistics. They were people making impossible choices in the dark.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate. We hope this discussion challenged your perspective on the forces that shaped the Civil War.
Dig into the sources yourself. There is always more to find. Until next time.